Hello, I'm Dan Sweeney, the Director of the Institute for Enterprise Ethics at the Daniels College of Business here on the University of Denver campus. I am pleased to present to you the 7th edition of the Institute's Quarterly Ethics Review. This program features several outstanding faculty members from the Daniels College of Business discussing a number of the most interesting and widely reported stories from the world of corporate ethics and responsibility from the previous 3 months. In this session, we'll talk about the latest CEO compensation data. We'll talk about Apple and Microsoft's arguments with the federal government on the protection of their customers' privacy rights. And we'll talk about the new wave of social activism by a number of corporations, especially with regard to gay and transgender rights. My colleagues for this discussion are 3 first-rate faculty members here at Daniels. Professor Don Mayer is Associate Professor of the Practice in the Department of Business Ethics and Legal Studies. Professor Amy Hamilton is Assistant Professor in the Department of Management, and Professor Andrew Schnackenberg is also an Assistant Professor in the Department of Management. So let's get on with the discussion. In May, the New York Times published their annual report on the level and structure of CEO compensation for the 200 highest paid CEOs of publicly traded United States companies that had filed their proxies by April 30, 2016. The average compensation package for these CEOs was $19.3 million, down 15% from last year. And for the first time in a long time, no CEO was paid more than $100 million. So, Amy, could it be that we're actually over the hump with respect to excessive levels of CEO compensation? And, as a follow-up, I'll give you right now, with regard to executive compensation, the Dodd-Frank requirement for corporations to report the ratio of their CEO's compensation relative to that of the median employee will be enforced for the 2018 proxy season. What effect do you think that will have on corporations' compensation policies in 2018?
Well, Dan, let me take your first question first. Are we over the hump with respect to excessive CEO compensation? And the answer to that is clearly no, we're not over the hump. So if you look at a broader swath of highest paid CEOs or well-paid CEOs, if you will, the top 350 American corporations, and let's be clear, we are talking about U.S. corporations here. So if we look at the top 350 highest paid CEOs, among that group, the average was $15.5 million in compensation, and it represented a decrease of about 5% relative to 2015 compensation levels. And so not quite as large of a reduction. So that's the first point. The second point is that if you look at what makes up the compensation, 83% of that can be explained by the dip in the stock market. So the weaker stock market in 2015. Because roughly 70% of CEO compensation is based on stock price, stock performance. So then I guess the second part of that question is about excessive levels of CEO compensation. And so excessive is a relative thing. How do you define excessive? So just to give you some idea of where CEO pay rates relative to other workers, and particularly non-managerial workers, the rate of pay, the growth in CEO pay since the recovery began in 2009 is roughly 47%, since 2009. In that same period, non-managerial pay has stagnated. So to me, that is excessive relative to non-managerial workers or relative to the labor market generally. The other issue is if you look at multiples, and this gets to the Frank Dodd ruling that's going to take effect with the SEC in 2018. So the Frank-Dodd ruling requires that CEO pay be disclosed as a ratio to the average non-managerial workers' pay. Those ratios in 1965, it was 20 to 1. Okay? In 2000, it was 376 to 1. Now we're back off that high. In 2015, it was 276 to 1. So we're off a little bit from the high, but still, that's an astronomical change in that ratio. So if those are the ratios that we're going to see disclosed in the annual reports come 2018, those are going to be pretty stunning numbers for shareholders and other stakeholders in corporations to see. My thought is it's going to have an effect. People are going to pay attention, but it's still not going to get to the underlying structural issues that are affecting CEO compensation, how CEOs are paid. And also, one other thought about the Frank-Dodd ruling. There's a lot of things you can do to define your average non-managerial worker. One thing, for example, is they exclude foreign workers. Could this have an unintended consequence, much like the unintended consequences of requiring CEO pay disclosure back in 1992? Could this have an unintended consequence of more outsourcing of labor? It's kind of hard to know what direction some of these well-intended regulations may end up taking things.
So Andrew, what do you think about this compensation issue?
Well, my feeling is the Dodd-Frank requirement is going to be limited in its ability to manage or resolve or help us understand issues of excessive executive compensation after it's been implemented. And the reason why is, as Amy alluded to, I don't think it actually deals with the underlying topic of pay inequality in the United States. What I believe it does do is provides another metric or another target of debate for us to discuss these issues, but I don't think it actually resolves the issues themselves. So until shareholders and the public have a general idea of what they consider to be excessive executive compensation, I don't see how this particular policy is going to inform the debate.
Don, any thoughts?
Well, just one or two, Dan. Thank you, Amy. It strikes me that the usual defense of these high rates of pay is that the market demands it. And it seems to me, and I'd like Amy's comments on this, it seems to me it's kind of a funny market. It's really maybe not that competitive. Women are excluded. It's almost like a clubby thing with the interlocking directorates. And so when people say, well, it's just what the market demands, it's odd to me that the market demands that in the U.S. because my impression, and I'm not sure here, my impression is that U.S. executive pay is far higher than comparable pay for Japanese companies or European companies. So some discussion on that, I would welcome the enlightenment there.
Well, let me make an observation, if I may, stepping out of my moderator role. That I'm an opinionated fellow. I don't think this ratio reporting is going to have any impact whatsoever, because I think everybody who's interested in the concept already knows what those numbers are generally, and will accept that they're just extraordinarily high, right? So I don't think it's going to have any effect at all. And Don, you're right that certainly European countries and Japanese, those CEO compensation levels aren't anywhere near what we've got. But on the other hand, those countries are much more homogeneous as well. So I think the 2015 numbers are sort of continue in what I would call an excessive amount of compensation, but I don't think it's going to shrink much, and it is what it is. And we'll gather again next May and take another look at the New York Times report. Thanks. Don, earlier this year we saw several major corporations, including Apple, Walmart, Salesforce.com, Eli Lilly, Anthem, American Airlines, and others, take very active positions against the recently passed Indiana law allowing discrimination against same-sex couples. More recently, we saw the same corporations and others, including Bank of America, NASCAR, Merck, and Alcoa, again, plus others, threaten a number of retaliatory actions against the state of North Carolina's recently passed law mandating certain behaviors for transgender persons' use of public restrooms. So, do you think corporations taking these kinds of social actions is an appropriate use of corporations' resources, especially if a large proportion of the employees, shareholders, and customers may not agree with the corporation's position? What do you think?
I think the answer is yes. It is appropriate for corporations to take positions on social and political issues, but not if employees, shareholders, and customers disagree with the corporation's position. Here's the larger context. Most companies have opposed laws they don't like, and they have proposed laws that they do like. They do this directly or through trade associations and lobbying. In the past, corporations have spoken out on the minimum wage, health care, education, and a lot more. And the list is getting longer. There was a recent survey by McKinsey & Company. And CEOs were asked, which of the following issues are most critical to address for the future success of your business? Well, what a list. 50% of CEOs talked about educational systems and talent constraints. 44% chose poor public governance. 38% chose climate change. 36% chose making globalization's benefits accessible to the poor, like bottom of the pyramid product development and marketing, microfinance. 35% chose security of energy supply, and the list goes on and on. So when CEOs engage their companies in these kinds of issues, as we all know, it offends Milton Friedman's famously stated belief, managers should reject any corporate expense that doesn't demonstrate a clear benefit to shareholders or the bottom line. So, nonetheless, lots of companies continue to take on social issues. Some have even put significant resources into play. Goldman Sachs, this will be my favorite example, last year put 4% of its pre-tax profits into women's issues, veterans issues, higher education, and community development. Nobody I know would classify Lloyd Blankfein as a socialist, and the investors are not clearly running for the exits either. But as to your question and why this might be a little murky, the benefits of these kind of active social initiatives are really hard to measure, and companies cannot always predict how things are going to turn out. So some predictions are easy. If you're Winchester or Remington in Connecticut, you're pro-NRA, and no one's going to debate that with you or say, we're not going to buy your products. So you're not going to lose any business there, but there are some tougher issues around, and some of these are highlighted by the Indiana law and the North Carolina law and many other state laws. So if you're pro-life and pro-choice, say you're a family business like Hobby Lobby, famous case in the Supreme Court a couple of years ago, you don't want to pay for contraception coverage for your employees because it offends your religious principles. Okay, but the essence of these laws that you're mentioning that have created such a stir, CEO activism, is to allow religious beliefs about marriage and gender identity to provide a legal excuse for businesses to discriminate against lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transvestites. So culturally, as we know, these are hot button issues for a lot of folks. The state laws themselves were a real trigger for the LGBT community and those companies and others who care about non-discrimination. So why would a company get engaged? Again, the mainstream view, maximizing shareholder value with regard to both of these bills, Indiana and North Carolina, it's really hard to say that this helps the company's bottom line. So here's where a little context might help. One thing is the laws are passed without a majority support among the population in either Indiana or North Carolina. That's one special circumstance. Secondly, most observers, legal thinkers and others, commentators, think that they are contrary to Supreme Court rulings, Romer versus Evans and other cases, and are probably unconstitutional. Third, and I think this is really important, they preempt local laws. So if Indianapolis or Charlotte wants to pass pro-LGBT non-discrimination measures, they can't do it. These are preemptive. So local communities that want to favor non-discrimination in these areas, they don't get a chance to do that. Now, it's not just CEO activists, celebrities, the NCAA, maybe we won't have the Final Four in Indianapolis anymore, that kind of thing, the NBA. Mayors, governors who say our state employees, our municipal employees cannot travel to these states. No more conventions, no more trips to these states. That's a lot of pushback. So again, it's kind of a special circumstance going on here. And also these laws were passed very quickly. Instead of weeks or months, they happened really fast, like in days. So the usual lobbying and persuasion techniques weren't available. So you've got Benny Ott and Tim Cook really coming out publicly, really coming out strong in ways that are a little bit unconventional. A lot of companies have decided that non-discrimination aligns with their company values, and they want their employees to know that. They want to know that their employees know that they're on the right side of this inclusiveness and non-discrimination. It would be a mistake for a CEO to take a stand that the board didn't agree with, or that the employees didn't agree with, or investors. So you obviously need to gauge that, and I think both Benny Ott of Salesforce and Tim Cook did that. A couple of things can be said. A smart CEO certainly will understand the board and the employees' sentiments and the customer sentiments and not antagonize them. And of course, a point that John Mackey makes a lot, if investors don't like what we're doing, they can certainly sell the stock. If the board doesn't like what I'm doing, they can replace me. If the employees don't like what I'm saying, they can leave. So my sense, particularly with Tim Cook, in responding to the Indiana law, I got a little quote here. He wasn't, even though he's openly gay, speaking just for himself. He was also speaking for his employees and the company. And he said, "Our message is this: Apple is open. Open to everyone regardless of where they come from, what they look like, how they worship, or who they love. Regardless of what the law might allow in Indiana or Arkansas, we will never tolerate discrimination." It's a message they love in Silicon Valley, even if some politicians in Indiana, North Carolina, and other states don't like it.
One thing I would I think an underlying point that you're making there, Don, is that really these companies aren't really going out on that big of a limb by objecting to these laws, that actually it's the states passing these laws that are perhaps arguably out of touch with their own populaces and with the broader trends in American society generally. So that's kind of one thing that I take away. And I wanted to build on your point about saying, like Tim Cook's comment being for not just himself but his employees, that if you take a stakeholder approach to corporate governance and to corporate activities as opposed to a narrow shareholder approach, which really is what we are trying to teach the next generation of business leaders, right. And it is a growing trend in businesses that a shareholder approach takes into consideration concerns for your community, for your employees, not just for the shareholders, so that there are other metrics that need to be followed beyond increasing shareholder value as narrowly defined by stock price. Shareholder value is really a long-term concept, right, originally, and it's the long-term viability of the company. And is this kind of a stance, this social activism, as Dan referred to it, is that really kind of in the long-term best interest of the companies themselves?
Right, and I think Dan's question really embraces that kind of stakeholder analysis, that we really need to be sensitive, yes, to the shareholders, but also to the employees and the customers. And in some case, as you point out, the popular sentiment, the consumers. And again, I don't think that I think you're entirely right. I don't think either Benioff or Cook has really gone that far off the mainstream. The mainstream is changing. Some people don't like it. That's one of the things that's happening.
Andrew, what do you think?
Well, I might disagree a little bit that the mainstream is changing so much, but I would also say, and in agreement with Don, that I do think increasingly these decisions of social activism are not necessarily seen as a misuse of the corporation's resources, but because the actual revenue generated from these kinds of decisions is so difficult to measure, as Don pointed out, I do think that there's a space to look at why these trends are continuing. And my view is that CEOs and organizations, this largely is a function of the blending of the work-life balance in these firms. So increasingly you have organizations which are allowing flex time and remote work and all different types of relaxed dress codes and the like, which enable employees to bring in their own identities to the firm, and this includes the executive suite. So with the blending of work-life balance over the last couple decades, I don't think it's a surprise that you see organizations taking a more active role in these social issues. But that would be the extent of it. I'm not exactly sure what the outcomes are going to be for these firms.
You know, it seems to me that the activism that gets noted and reported have two characteristics. One, they're voiced by an identifiable personality, like Tim Cook, or Mr. Benioff, or Howard Schultz, and so on. So it's a personality that people know, and they can attach this point of view to that person, which is very different than attaching the point of view to the corporation.
Right.
The second thing I think is characteristic of these issues is that the issue itself is controversial. It's unsettled. So, and that's certainly the case with transgender restroom uses. It's certainly the case with same-sex marriage, although that's very rapidly getting settled by the courts. So, yeah, I think those are the unique things. Don, you went through a laundry list of other kinds of causes that corporations support. Sure. They don't get reported. You know, even things as valuable as early education. Women's rights, things like that. I mean, that's just the standard stuff, right? But you get into one of these and attach it to a known person, and you're going to get some headlines.
And especially if the law has quickly passed and then creates a kind of a target. Because a lot of the times when the companies are doing social issues, I mentioned Goldman Sachs, but women's issues, community development, this all goes under the media radar.
Sure.
Once there's a law passed and a CEO has to attack it or feels like he or she must attack it, then it draws a lot more media attention as well.
Right. I expect we'll see a lot more of it in coming months and years. So it'll be an exciting time, as always. Andrew, in a celebrated story earlier this year, Apple Corporation took a position in defiance of a federal judge's order to accede to the FBI's request to open an iPhone that had been used by one of the San Bernardino shooters. Also around the same time, Microsoft filed 2 suits in defiance of an order to allow the FBI access to customers' data in their cloud storage system. So do you think a corporation is entitled to place their perceived responsibilities to protect their customers' rights to privacy above the corporation's responsibilities to promote national security and law enforcement? What do you think?
I think that's a tremendously difficult question, and I don't believe that there's a very straightforward answer to it today. I think that what we're looking at are a couple of different trends in how organizations are wrestling with traditional assumptions about privacy as they're confronted with modern calls for increased transparency. So what I'd like to do is maybe talk a little bit about some things that are unfolding right now which might give some sense of an answer to that question. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the role of government in ensuring cybersecurity in different countries, including the United States. Increasingly, they are reliant on organizations to be transparent and cooperate with them in order for them to build effective cybersecurity infrastructures. So that's one trend we're seeing around the world. The second trend is organizations are increasingly relying on their informational advantages held by privacy of what they consider to be their databases and their customer information in order to compete effectively in their markets. On top of that, you've got issues of multiple stakeholders, especially in this case with Apple and Microsoft as they compete internationally. So bending to the United States government and opening up their information or their security systems for their customers' data to one government might set a dangerous precedent for other governments. So given all these trends, I really don't see any straightforward answer to the question of whether or not organizations should comply with government or safeguard their customers' data. On the other hand, I do think we can make some predictions about what might happen in this case as we move forward. And one would be, for example, the instances of terrorism and terrorist attacks on different countries' soil, I think will have a positive relationship with the pressure placed on corporations to reveal information to the government in these cases. So far, we've seen sort of an upward trend of terrorism over the last couple of years, and if that were to continue, I could imagine there being a great deal of pressure on organizations to comply with different governmental requests for information. On the other hand, I think organizations' ability to compete internationally is also at stake. So the ability for Apple and Microsoft to maintain competitive positions overseas is also dependent on whether or not they can control this information. So their competitiveness might actually also drive their responses to these issues. So I would have to give you a mixed response of a yes and a no, but I think that if we stay tuned, we will get more clarity on these issues.
Well, let me ask you this, because you brought up prediction, the idea of prediction.
Yes.
So if we were here 10 years from now and the same situations occurred, how do you think Mr. Cook's successor would handle that request? Or the judge's order, which is a little more powerful?
It's a good question. I think it's an excellent question, and I believe if we were 10 years from now, and I would place it as dependent on our cybersecurity infrastructure and our development of technical capabilities in order to safeguard this type of personally identifiable information, and if those were developed enough, I don't think you'd see much of a different response. On the other hand, if we're not able to make a great deal of headway in protecting national assets, things like top secret information, if you want to call it that, at the federal level, then I do think that you're going to see additional pressure. So yeah, I would have to say it's just dependent on where we are now versus where we're going to be 10 years from now.
Don, what's your view?
I think the whole issue of privacy is kind of, as my friend George Peary says, squishy. It's a concept that is really hard to get your hands around. I mean, if you buy something from Apple and it's an iPhone and you want it secure, and one of the reasons you buy it is that it's secure and that it maintains privacy, that's a value, but it's not a value that's written into the U.S. Constitution. It is written into the California Constitution, interestingly enough, but it hasn't been litigated enough for us to be clear about what it means. And in general, going back to this 10-year question, and I think Andrew's very good response, it's going to depend on a lot of factors 5, 10 years from now. Does society, the U.S. in particular, value security and order more than it values privacy? And it looks like, whether you're looking at Cleveland today, tonight, tomorrow, law and order is back as a political catchphrase. And if people have to choose collectively and lawfully, politically, between security and order on the one hand and privacy and terror on the other, I suspect we will go towards doing away with privacy in the way that a lot of people would like to hold on to their secrets.
It's a slippery slope, though. Really is. The difference between invasion of privacy out of necessity because of the war on terror versus totalitarian governments really using it as a way to control people and to suppress freedom of speech and things like that. It's a slippery slope. So it's a problematic issue. Right. I feel as though the response of Apple and Microsoft to this issue is more about protecting their intellectual property than it is about protecting the privacy of their customers. And I also think, I don't know about you, Don, or Andy, or Dan, but I didn't buy an iPhone because of the privacy of my data. I bought an iPhone because of the convenience, because it's got my calendar, it's got my cell phone, my email, my text. I bought it for the product features, but not privacy per se. To me, I think privacy is something that we take for granted and we expect, but it's not necessarily guaranteed or a right. And I also think the bottom line is that we're responsible for protecting the privacy of our own information. If there are things like, these celebrities putting their pictures, naked selfies on the iCloud, if you don't want other people to have access to personal things about you, don't put it on your device. So I feel like it comes down to a personal responsibility issue.
Between you and Andrew, though, there's this amazing issue about the brand of Apple and its international competitiveness, and the fact that around the world a lot of governments are mistrusted, and for a lot of very good reasons. And so it might make sense for Apple to kind of guard this sense of privacy to where, Google got in trouble, Yahoo really got in trouble going to China and allowing access by the Chinese government to its data. So, in a sense, where is the future going? Where would a business want to align itself? And it may, I think, as you were pointing out, Andrew, want to align itself with the consumer and the right to protect privacy. And it is your responsibility, of course, but if you're keeping it private and you're not putting it on the cloud, do you want your iPhone manufacturer to allow the government in?
If I can, again, step out of my moderator role, it seems to me, and Don, I'm going to address this to you because you've got a legal background. It seems to me that Apple and Microsoft both may be taking these sort of preemptive moves to file their own suits in an attempt to get more clarity on the issue, to get it adjudicated and get it moving up the court system so that they can have much more clarity and much more certainty in what they're likely going to be allowed to do and not do. And I say that simply because I think those are two companies that are kind of on the forefront of figuring these things out. Anything else you want to talk about in terms of privacy releases?
Well, I think the adjudicated point is a good one because it does establish a public discourse about the issue, and in some sense, if they can't do anything else, if they can't appeal it any further, then they can tell their customers we've tried.
Yep.
Right.
So that's actually a big thing. They're going to bat for the privacy of the customer, and it's probably important that they be seen to do that.
Very good. Thank you very much. Okay, here's a couple of questions for all three of you to respond to with 2 or 3 quick sentences. The first one has to do with prescription drug pricing. Over the past several years, many large and small pharmaceutical manufacturing corporations have adopted a strategy of identifying and sometimes acquiring existing prescription drugs designed for very specific and often rare life-threatening diseases, and then raising the prices of these drugs by orders of magnitude, causing annual costs to the insurance companies and the patients in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, is there any way to rationalize this extremely aggressive pricing strategy beyond the simple idea of extraordinary greed?
No. I mean, this is profit-seeking behavior on the part of a corporation. On the one hand, you could argue that it's a very clever strategy. You purchase a drug, even if it's gone into generic mode, where the patent is gone, And you bet that it's going to be too expensive for another company to pick it up and produce a generic version. So you could argue that's a very, very clever profit-seeking behavior. Is it what's been intended to have happen in this highly regulated industry? No. I think it goes beyond the intentions of the regulators. I mean, the drug manufacturers are allowed to charge large prices because they want to encourage R&D, right? That's the whole point, is to give drug companies an opportunity to recoup their large R&D investments. And that's rational, otherwise we wouldn't have the kind of production that we have. But this, in the case of these sorts of drugs, like what Shkreli did, it's clear that this is simply pure rent seeking. There's no value, there's no creation of additional value to consumers, to society, and furthermore, the costs of this drug, the R&D costs of this drug, were recouped long ago.
Right. The government has actually legalized a monopoly here by, first of all, granting patent rights, and secondly, you say it's highly regulated, but most commentators think it's very much misregulated in terms of, say, for example, not allowing generics from that have been approved in Germany to be sold here. So essentially it's a market failure. There's not enough competition. First of all, you grant these drug companies a monopoly for a certain number of years, and then when it goes generic, as in the Shkreli case and Valiant Pharmaceuticals, you've got not enough competition because they're not going to enter the market because the regulation requires a lot of hoops for these companies to go through. So Shkreli and others took bets that others were not going to come in the market, and they were right. So they could jack it up, 20-fold, 100-fold, and beyond. And also, it's the federal government that is paying about a third of research costs on new drugs. Most critics would say that the big pharma folks are essentially paying most of their money in marketing and talking to doctors. And of course, it's all so complicated with Medicare funds and Medicaid funds and how these drugs get paid for. It's a regulatory mess. And there's no rationale in terms of this is just what the market will bear, because there isn't the competition there should be.
I would also agree. I don't think that there's a way to rationalize this beyond the simple idea of extraordinary greed. I would also just draw the attention to the healthcare system at large and suffering from similar problems. For example, the Cleveland Clinic is known to bill little travel-sized cases of toothpaste for roughly $10 to $15 to their patients. And so when you talk about the markup on something like that, and then you look at these drugs and the manufacturing of pharmaceuticals, it's just not really something that's confined. It's a system-wide issue. It's a complex issue. I would agree with the misregulated statement. So it's difficult to look at this in isolation without looking at the combining parts that make up the whole healthcare system.
Right. Exactly.
Let me make an observation, because this isn't the first time we brought this topic up for a quarterly ethics review. We've done it a couple of times. And my personal view is that it's a terrible example of even very large, very successful pharmaceutical companies employing this strategy and having the effect of adding dramatically to the high cost of healthcare in this country. Because they know that the cost will be passed on to insurance companies, and then through the insurance companies through their premiums to the rest of us. And I think that's an out of balance set of priorities. The second quick hit question has to do with the automobile industry and some evidences of just blatant misbehavior. Starting with Toyota a number of years ago and their sticky accelerator pedal problem, General Motors' ignition switch problem, and moving to the more recent Takata exploding airbags, Mitsubishi's falsified fuel economy statistics, and of course, Volkswagen's secret emission control software. The auto industry seems to be playing their own game of catch me if you can. So what is there something unique about the automobile industry that's kind of enabling or encouraging this kind of what I consider gross misbehavior? What do you think?
Well, I would start by saying that I think the auto industry really has become a highly, highly institutionalized field, and that behavior in this industry has become kind of a standard just taken for granted. There's not a whole lot of change. The vehicles that are introduced a year-over-year basis are generally touted as being brand new and offering brand new features, but they often look very similar to the prior year's features. So when you have an industry that becomes so commoditized, or at least appears to be becoming very much commoditized, I think it's not too unusual to see organizations to seek revenues, seek increased margins from whatever tactics available to them. And then I think that's kind of what you're seeing in the auto industry. I think you're seeing a lax regulatory structure. You're seeing bailouts of automobile companies, and that encourages moral hazard. So really, in general, I'm not too surprised. I think some auto manufacturers, such as Tesla, which are trying to kind of revamp or revolutionize the auto industry, might change these types of behaviors because they'll put more competitive pressure on these incumbents. But so far, I do think it's just something that happens over time with long-standing institutionalized industries.
I think also to Andy's point about the kind of business as usual approach in the automobile industry, a couple of other things going on there. It's an incredibly expensive, very low, relatively low margin actual consumer product, right? It's ubiquitous. There's an intense amount of competition for that marginal dollar of profit. And so it encourages corner cutting and unethical behavior in that sense. The other point about the structure of the automobile industry is this, I guess for lack of a better word, the distribution of decision making, this just-in-time manufacturing structure of the industry that's been adopted by most of the manufacturers, where you have these original equipment manufacturers providing parts to the large car manufacturers on a just-in-time basis. They're really independent companies. So a lot of points where bad decisions, unethical decisions can be made all along the production curve. And so that, again, creates a lot of opportunities for misbehavior.
All good points. I'm reminded of the institutionalized bureaucratic nature of these companies, where there's many levels of management. And when we first heard about the VW emissions test defeating software back in the fall, there was a lot of speculation. Well, was this just a group of rogue managers at mid-level? Well, there was an article today in the New York Times which, if you followed bureaucratic organizations and the auto industry for any length of time, you realize that the orders come down from the top. And whether it's Iacocca telling his folks, get it done for $2,000 and 2,000 pounds or less, whatever the marching orders are, people will do that, and that you deny knowing anything about it if you're at the top. So that was the first thing that VW said, well, we're looking into this. We're trying to find out just who is responsible for these horrible decisions. And we're taking all kinds of measures to make sure this never happens again and that those people are weeded out. Well, it turns out, no surprise, again, if you follow the auto industry, it went all the way to the top. Not just Winterkorn, who's resigned, but Mueller, who took his place. He was head of Audi, and the whole thing started with Audi. He knew. So if you read through this, you realize that once again, and whether it's the Toyota thing or Mary Barra taking over at GM after this horrible ignition switch business, which if you haven't really studied it, it's incomprehensible how a manufacturer could put a product out on the market that it knew would be killing people. But then you think, oh yes, but there was the Pinto. At least with VW, they weren't killing people, they were just defrauding people. And that's the best you could say. But in that case and in many others, it's the bureaucratic nature of the organization that allows things to get started and hope for the best. It's also this behavioral economics and psychology thing where we're going to take the short-term view. We don't ever think we're going to get caught. That's a characteristic of human beings, whether they're in organizations or not. So We need to be number one. Toyota thought they needed to be number one. That's one of the reasons they lost their quality control. VW wanted to be number one in North America. So that kind of goal, that kind of pressure throughout the organization is felt, and people will do what they have to do to somehow win, losing sight of the larger picture. And of course, the larger picture is always the future. And who could have predicted in VW that they would be facing the colossal fines? And now these legal actions by not only the Attorney General of New York, Schneiderman, but also the Attorney General of Massachusetts. The shareholders should be irate.
Well, in this case, the shareholders all have vested interests in Volkswagen, because a large chunk of the shareholders are the citizens of Westphalia. It's not a county, but
Yeah,
it's a
province,
or something. And another group of shareholders are the unions, and another group of shareholders are the family. And there's like no independent governance in there. They're all conflicted, and from what I've read, and I've come to think that these three factions are kind of helping each other to keep this thing afloat. And you'll see a lot of money being pumped into Volkswagen from not only Westphalia but from Berlin as well, I expect.
Quite true, Dan. But you know they're not happy with what's happened. I mean, these costs are enormous. But yes, they still want to keep it going.
Well, that's right.
For sure.
Yeah. Well, okay. More to come, I'm sure.
Oh, yes.
Thanks.
Oh, yes.